rightly point out, I've got a number of gigs today, but hopefully you won't be bored with this particular one. So let me share my screen. So let me start this discussion by filling in a bit of background for people who may not have really thought very much about this side of things. So the background is that the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, as its friends know it, is an intergovernmental organization which was founded by the G7 of advanced countries to develop policies to combat money laundering and the financing of terrorism. Laudable ambitions, I'm sure you will agree. It produces a series of recommendations on international standards which regulators in individual jurisdictions can implement. And for our purposes, we are interested in recommendation 16, which covers payments. That's the business we're in. Now, in the first half of this year, FATF instituted a public consultation on proposed changes to this recommendation. They had a previous one, which we responded to, and which resulted in publication of a new set of regulations, or revised set of regulations, I should say, in October or November of last year. But they decided to go around again. So we responded to the proposed changes on our own account, saying what our view was. We also worked with other organisations, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, GSMA, and the World Bank, to coordinate and improve our responses. So, FATF Recommendation 16 is designed to stop the use of payments. They call them wire payments, but actually they're just payments to fund fraud or money laundering or financing of terrorism or proliferation financing. They're just electronic payments. People always talk about them as cross-border payments, but actually the FATF regulations are intended to cover everything down to different accounts at the same institution. And specifically, it intends to ensure that basic information about who sent a payment and who received the payment is immediately available to people who have a legitimate interest in knowing this. And that is, first of all, law enforcement authorities. They need to trace funds and investigate crimes. Financial intelligence units need this information to analyze suspicious activity and publicize, for instance, new scams, those sorts of things, and also to participants in the payment so that they can deny criminals and terrorists access to the payment system. But essentially, it's designed to be able to answer the question, who is paying whom? Now, as you would expect, since it was originating from the G7 advanced economies, the group of 7 advanced economies, it's really designed around quite large-scale payments. I mean, people who are buying large things. So they recognize that there might be a smaller class of payments where the same thing would not be necessary. And in order to cater for this, they proposed as a suggestion what they call the de minimis exemption. Now, basically that proposes that payments underneath a certain amount should require less identifying information. It can be set individually by jurisdictions, and they recommend that it should be set at or below a maximum of $1,000 US. We are against this, we the Modular Foundation. First of all, because there's no obvious way for a sending institution in a cross-border payment to know whether or not the jurisdiction of the receiving institution has a de minimis exemption, and if it does have a de minimis exemption, what that exemption is. Second problem, limits which are set in US dollars may be subject to wide variations and indeed to drift over time in illiquid currencies due to exchange rate fluctuation. Now, essentially, that means that if I set a rate of $1,000 and my currency then depreciates by 25%, I've actually set the rate 25% higher than it would otherwise be, and it's really intended to be. So that's problematic. The only reliable course of action is to assume that there is no de minimis exemption because people don't want their payments to be rejected. The other point about it, which is a genuinely bad thing, I think, is that basically it just encourages bad actors to set up networks of small payments so they can get round the FATF recommendations in the first place. So we are against the de minimis exemption, I hope for reasons that everybody will agree with. So what happened in the latest consultation? Well, we proposed the de minimis exemption should be removed. There should be a reliance on the existing exemption for payments which are not based on account numbers. I'll come on to that in a moment. And there should be a retention of the unique customer number as a way of identifying parties to a payment. Now, what the recommendation used to say was that a DFSP could just include a unique customer number as a reference in the payment. It didn't have to include any other information in the payment. And that meant that small DFSPs didn't need to provide detailed information about their customers, particularly in cases where, as FATF themselves recognise, that information may not be reliable or properly warranted. So we recommended that this should be retained. FATF responded by retaining the de minimis exemption, retaining the account number exemption, thank goodness, and removing the unique customer number, which is a problem for us. The reason it's a problem for us is because without a unique customer number, if we have to send information about customers and if people have to receive information about customers, then personal identifying information is covered by very considerable, and rightly so, it's covered by very considerable legal protections. And people who are storing this information, as recipients of payment requests will need to do, need to take considerable security measures to make sure that that information remains safe. We would rather that small institutions were not involved in that. And therefore, we wanted to remove that as far as possible. However, there was one gift in Pandora's box. I tried to get another illustration of Pandora's box, but amazingly, all of the ones that I came across were of scantily clad women peering into boxes. This one isn't. But the Latinists among you, of whom I know there will be many, will have pointed out that will have seen immediately that all of the things that came out of Pandora's box are really rather valuable things like equity and perseverance and those sorts of things, rather than the dreadful plagues which the normal Pandora's box issued. However, the last person climbing out of the box, whom you can see on the right-hand side there, is indeed labelled Hope. So there is still hope. And the hope came in rather an odd form. They said that they wanted to lighten the burden of responsibility on institutions where both the beneficiary and the originating institution, i.e. both parties to the payment, participated in a pre-validation mechanism. Well, goodness, he said. Clearly, this is the case with modular systems. As everybody knows, we have an agreement of terms phase, which means that both the parties have access to information about each other's customers in advance of the terms of the payment being agreed. But I also want to emphasize that this applies if the beneficiary and the ordering financial institutions both participate in a pre-validation mechanism. And that means, I think, that both the sender and the receiver have to be involved in an end-to-end agreement of terms and a validation of terms. And if that's the case, then they would be able to have a lighter burden of proof. But that would exclude architectures where schemes or proxies are responsible for approval. So we've seen a number of these proposed for interacting between systems. I think that this means that the exemption relies on verifiable communications between the parties to the payment. And that's, I think, an important thing. So what are the important things? Sorry, what are the requirements? For all transfers, they should contain the name of the originator, the name of the beneficiary, and a unique transaction number, because we don't use accounts. The name does not need to be a legal name. It just needs to be a name. For transfers above the de minimis limit, it also needs to include the address of the originator, the country and town of the beneficiary, and the date of birth, where the sender is what's called a natural person, which means just a person. Where the originator is a legal person, that is an organization, an institution, can be either a business identification code or an LEI. You'll be finding out lots more about LEIs later on today, or their unique official identifier. So the consequence of that is that there's no personally identifying information here. There's nothing other than a name, and that's not a legal name. It doesn't have to be a legal name. But this is where the PII creeps in. So essentially what we're saying is that for transfers above the de minimis limit, we need to include, at least potentially, personal identifying information, with potentially problems for small businesses, small DFSPs, who may not have the facilities to store this. So let's look at a potential way forward for this. If the originator sends the requested terms as if the payment were below the exemption limit, and that's, as we've seen, without any personally identifying information, if the beneficiary can't accept the payment at all, then it rejects the payment request. Otherwise, it checks to see if the amount of the transfer is indeed below the de minimis exemption for its jurisdiction. If it's not, or if there is no de minimis exemption, then the payment needs to contain PII. If the beneficiary can meet the requirements for storing PII, can't meet the requirements for storing PII, then it rejects the payment request. Otherwise, it sends a request to the originator for additional information, and the originator furnishes the information and submits the requested terms again, this time including the required information. And now the beneficiary should be in possession of the information it needs to agree the terms of payment, including meeting the current FATF recommendation 16 requirements. It can now decide whether it's going to accept the payment request or not. Let me just show how that happens in sequence. So the payer creates a transfer request with the content for an exemption. It sends it to the receiver, who says, can payment be accepted at all? If not, it rejects the transfer, and that's the end of it. If it can, it asks whether the payment is below the de minimis limit or not. If it isn't, it asks if it can accept PII, personally identifying information. If it can't, then it rejects the transfer, as before. If it can, it requests further information and sends that back to the payer. The payer adds this content and returns another transfer request with the personally identifying information. If all of the information is present, and that's the same question we would come to if the payment were below the de minimis limit, if all of the information is present, then that says transfer rejection, but it should say transfer acceptance. Oh, sorry, if no, sorry, my mistake. It says if there isn't enough information, then it rejects the payment. If there is, it confirms the terms of the transfer, sends it back to the terms of the payment. So I think that provides us with a way forward, which will enable us to remain, or enable Moduloop schemes to remain aligned with the recommendations of FATF recommendation 16, while not requiring small or informal institutions to take on responsibilities which are fundamentally beyond their powers. It also means that effectively what we're saying is that the agreement of terms now says for a payer institution to request a for the payer institution to request a payment is to make a warranty that its customer can legitimately make that payment. For the receiving institution to approve the terms of a payment means that it is warranting that its customer can legitimately receive that payment. So therefore, the confirmation, the agreement of terms phase gives us a reliable warranty on both sides that those parties can legitimately make or receive those payments. And that is all I have to say on that. So there's a question from Greg. Can't they just use the PII to make their determination but not keep it at rest? Possibly, but we normally expect, and we think regulators normally expect, that institutions should keep the full text of the messages on which they based their payments. And indeed, if there are disputes at all, they will be asked to provide their copies of those messages to confirm that they did contain all of the information on which they based their actions.
There's one more question from Miller.
Why is there no use of the PII on the beneficiary institution? And the answer is because the beneficiary institution already knows about its customer. All of this stuff is predicated on non-agreement of terms transfers, where essentially as much information as possible needs to be passed with the initial request. Because we're doing agreement of terms, all the receiving institution needs to say is, do I recognize who this payment is intended for? And do I have sufficient information about them for them legitimately to receive this payment? They are not relying anymore on PII being sent from the sending institution.
Oh, sorry, Michael. I meant that we are required to transmit it, as you said in your diagram there, from the originator to the beneficiary, full details of the originator. But there's no processing of that information on the receiving side. That's a complete waste of time. So if we're required to do it, why don't we simply encrypt it, send it across? We've met the burden. We can recover it later if we need it under forensic order, but we're not going to do anything with it. And that also obviates the need to do any kind of processing or storage of the PII on the beneficiary side.
Yes, we could do that. I think
the whole thing, of course, is completely ridiculous that FATF would require us to send information that we can make no use of.
Yes. But in fact, since we do not need to make any use of it, you're right, we could simply encrypt it.
Yeah, so if this is really to support a forensic audit later, then make sure the information is available at rest in the receiving institution, but does not expose them to any kind of privacy processing risk that they would have, or that be available in the clear. I think that's what I'm seeing. But the other thing that concerns me is the additional round trip. That is, can I store it or not? No, I need more information. You have to go back for more information. Why not just send it across, as we do? We send everything we know about the originator in the initial exchange for agreement of terms. Is that what you're describing here, or are you describing a FATF ISO procedures?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the last part of the question.
So in our agreement of terms you're not describing that here. That's not how ours works. Ours is a single exchange. We send one information in the forward direction. It is then, if we want to proceed, it's signed and returned. If we don't, we send back a simply, I'm not going to proceed message, but we provide no additional information. What you've described here is two exchanges, an initial attempt, and then a follow-up information that responds to a request for more information. But Mojaloop doesn't work that way. So how do we work back the other? How do we get back to a single forward exchange, which is what makes this whole thing really work efficiently in Mojaloop?
Well, I think that the encryption answer, if regulators found that acceptable, would be sufficient. Now the question,
Why wouldn't? Sorry. Let me just restate that. Wouldn't we know in advance whether PII can be handled or processed by the receiving institution, since they're part of a scheme? And if we knew that in advance, then we don't have to wait for them to ask us for more information. We would simply send whatever, in whatever form it's required, as part of the original agreement of terms. It's all in the scheme rules.
Well, yes. So that would work reasonably well with single scheme. It would be much more complicated to administer for a multi-scheme scheme like that of DRPP, where essentially what you're saying, and it's the problem with the de minimis exemption in general, is that a sending institution may not immediately know or have any obvious way of knowing what the receiving institution's rules are. Sorry, the receiving jurisdiction's rules are.
I see. So, I mean, the real challenge is, while we could say we're going to ignore the de minimis rule because it's complicated, it slows things down, it probably causes failed payments. So if we ignore it and just always do things the same way, we improve outcomes. But I think your point would be that, yes, but if the receiving institution relies on low value payments not carrying PII for its own processing overheads, we would be violating their ability. And
Indeed.
Placing unfortunately an unfunded mandate on them. I see the issue, but so this looks like it requires a little bit more processing still. Obviously, we would like FATF to just get out of the way. They're proceeding on something that really doesn't have any value for low value payments, and their reaction by using de minimis isn't really that helpful. So we need a better solution, and it would seem to me that looking at our simple agreement of terms is maybe something that needs to be advanced with FATF and explain why it needs to be a single exchange. And it can't be this back and forth that would otherwise be required, as I now follow your logic.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, you're absolutely right. The problem is representing something to FATF is not, I think, as easy as it appears. We talk quite a lot between ourselves, BMGF, GSMA, and the World Bank about how we could influence this process. And I have to say that the result of our talk was very little. However, Dr. TT at the Bank of Uganda, I sent him a version of, not of this presentation, but of the material in it. And he says he is going to talk to his regulatory department about it and see what they think. So there's a possibility that we might be able to work with them to arrive at a more satisfactory solution. How we would get from there to something changing in FATF is a very different question, but at least it's a start. And it is a central bank that's doing it.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for that update.
It's a pleasure.